Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at an overview to the Renaissance, which is going to be the first era that we're going to study. Mainly, the study of humanities takes a look at epochs or eras of human development, and we seek to understand how each era understands humanity differently as social and historical and cultural changes happen. It changes the way that we see ourselves, and so our cultural manifestations are going to change accordingly. And so today what I want to take a look at is give you a basic overview of the Renaissance and some of the major ideas that come from the Renaissance. And that will lay kind of a bedrock, a foundation for our understanding of some of the ideas that we're going to continue and talk about later. Just by way of outline for our discussion of the Renaissance, and this is going to happen over multiple lectures. We're going to take a look at, on Friday, the historical context of where the Renaissance comes from. Then we'll take a look at some of the philosophies and the ideas that come from the Renaissance. And then next week, we're going to take a look at aesthetics, which is the idea, understanding of beauty and how to make sense of the outside world. And then we'll leave off with our discussion on the Renaissance in the next couple of weeks, talking about the visual art and literature that comes from this era. So hopefully by the end of this first unit on the Renaissance, you should be able to understand these five key points. You should be able to understand the meaning of the term Renaissance and how this era differed from the one that preceded it. And so this is giving you an outline for your notes to know what to mainly get out of these lectures as you're listening to them and going through them. Number two, I want you to understand why the Renaissance is known as the birth of the modern era, and know why Florence became the economical, political, and cultural capital of Europe that helped to bring about the Renaissance, right? So what's going on in Florence that's significantly different than everywhere else that creates a dramatic change in how we do things. Number four, I want you to know the intellectual developments that occurred as a result of the economic, political, and cultural developments. And so what happened as a result of these changes, what kind of ideas, philosophies come out of this era. And then I want you to know the main aesthetic principles of the Italian Renaissance and to know how they start to apply these ideas to the cultural manifestations of the arts. Taking a look at the assignment that I had you do on Zoom, just by way of review to bring this together, I had you imagine that the U.S. government suddenly ended. So thinking of some post-apocalyptic film, which are quite popular, and it kind of feels like we're living in a post-apocalyptic age in 2020. And then I had you consider how each of the following would be affected, right? How, if we didn't really have the U.S. government, how would that affect our army, right? Could the army really function the way it normally does? How would the court systems work? Would the U.S. Supreme Court, the district courts, the local courts start to break down? How would prisons function? Who's going to oversee them, right? Because the government's paying for the armies, the courts, the prisons, they're overseeing them. How would businesses be affected? Would businesses be affected at all, right? How would roads and bridges, which the government generally maintains, how would they be affected? And how would, if they start to deteriorate, how would that affect businesses, right? How would it affect currency, which the United States backs its currency and insures its currency? So how would that start to break down? Would we move to more of a bartering system? How would education change as a result of this? How would science and medicine be affected by this? Or agricultural, art, how would Facebook, YouTube, Google, would we even have those anymore? Or would it start to break down? How would our beloved football, college football, start to be affected by this? And we kind of feel some of this, I guess, feels a little too relevant today. Television, how would electricity, water, sanitation, how would it all really function, right? And then I had you think about how this would affect daily life, right? How would you be able to travel, right? Would you be able to still fly in a plane? Would that be out? Would you still be able to drive down the road? Would there be gas stations? How would it affect your work schedule? How would it affect your family life? How would it affect the way that you live? What jobs do you think would then be available? Would it change the types of jobs that are out there? And would it change the way that we interact with one another? And the reason why I had you think about this is it sets the stage for the Middle Ages. And what we have with the Middle Ages, which is a time period roughly between 400 and 1400. And just to give you some context on the term the Middle Ages, that's a term that we've applied as we've taken a look at the art and the culture and the ideas from this era, from this 1,000-year period. We apply it afterwards. And so it's not like the people in the Middle Ages knew that they were living in the Middle Ages. They thought they were living in the modern, world. And so the Middle Ages is something that is kind of applied retrospectively. But I want you to think about some of the attributes, right? Because what happened with them is the Roman Empire, which was the main governing body, broke down and fell apart. And as a result of this, it radically changed daily life, right? So what you have, rather than having a unifying Roman culture, you have varying cultures. People kind of return to their agrarian type of life. Right? There's no really a lot of trade or travel between areas because roads then become quite dangerous. If there's no police force or no military to protect people from traveling, there's not going to be anyone that travels. And so businesses start to break down. And so people say, I'm not really going to, use that trade of shipping and exporting my goods across the Mediterranean. It's no longer safe, or I'm no longer able to do that. So I'm just going to go back to living kind of a subsistence type of life. And so what you have are people, bandits that would actually live and travel or live off the roads, and they would wait for someone to come by and they would rob them. And so what happens during the Middle Ages is most people were born and they died within 1 square mile. And that's it. That's all they would travel. They wouldn't necessarily leave the comforts or the security of their small village. And what you also have is, rather than having a unifying language of Latin, most of the common people just kind of return to speaking their native tongue, right? And so it starts to change language, it starts to change customs starts to break down, and we see the loss of these older Roman customs and rituals start to fall away. But then what we have is the rise of Christianity that happens simultaneously. And so really what happens with Christianity is that it fills the void. It becomes the unifying body. So it kind of sees itself as the kind of self-proclaimed new ruler of this, European Mediterranean world. And so then they start to become the dominating force. And so Christianity maintains a lot of that unity. It maintains Latin. And so a lot of the clergy and the people that were part of the church leadership, they all spoke a common language, which was Latin, but that was different from what the average person would be able to speak. The Christian church took over the schools, and so if people were educated during this time, it was because they were educated by church-run schools. And for the most part, they were taught very, strict Christian principles. And it also had this constant dominance over cultural life. And so you see things like Dante's Inferno, which is a secular work, but it's centered around Christian thought, because Christianity has such a wide kind of swath or wide net that it casts. People could not see outside of Christian thinking, or at least they didn't really want to. And so what we have with Dante's Inferno is Dante, who is the writer of the text, he puts himself as a character. And as the character Dante is in the text, he's kind of a wayward person. He's kind of made some mistakes. And so he's sent on this journey through hell to see how people suffer, what are the sins, and how are the sins punished in hell. And he's given a Roman poet named Virgil as his tour guide, and he gives them this tour through various aspects of what people do for sin and how they're going to be punished. And but it's, even though it's a secular text, it still has this very Christian idea to it. It shows people what they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to live their life as a moral, virtuous life. You have to follow Christian principles. And so he's visited by three particular beasts: a she-wolf, a lion, and a leopard. And So it's kind of interesting. Charles Dickens kind of borrows this kind of theme with his A Christmas Story, where a person, Ebenezer Scrooge, is kind of a wayward person, and he's visited by three ghosts in order to mend his ways. Charles Dickens borrows that story from Dante's Inferno, this idea of trying to change someone's behavior in order to correct them and bring them on the right path. But what we also see during this era is most of the art, the music, the literature, the scholarly works, as we see with Dante's Inferno, in some way or another deal with Christianity because it was so pervasive. Most of the composers during this time were clergy, were priests, or they were monks, or something of the sort. So in many ways, there was no quote-unquote outside the church. It touched all aspects of human culture. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see the Cult of Mary, which is, this is kind of a secular poem, but it's written to Jesus' mother, Mary, as kind of a romantic poem. It sounds kind of weird, but the idea was to woo Mary into falling in love with them, so then she could appeal to Jesus for their salvation. It sounds kind of weird, but that was kind of the mindset, the Cult of Mary, of paying tribute or homage to Mary in order to try to win her grace. And here it says, "O most holy, O most lovely, sweet Virgin Mary, beloved Mother, undefiled, pray for us. You are solace and refuge, Virgin Mother Mary. Whatever we wish, we hope it through you. Pray for us. Look, we are weak and deeply deplorable. Save us, O Mary. Take away our lassitude. Heal our pains. Pray for us. Virgin, look at us. Mother, care for us. Hear us, O Mary. You bring divine medicine. Pray for us." Right? So this idea of bringing salvation, not directly through Jesus because he's pretty busy, but through his mother instead. But for the most part, the majority of the population, 90% of the population in the Middle Ages, were illiterate. And so what this meant was that in order for people to be able to understand what's in the Bible, they'd have to go to their priest, and they would have to go to their clergy for understanding. And so that is a huge amount of power, the power of education, the power of ideas. It plays a huge part during the Middle Ages. And it also, you see that dominance of Christianity over the government. And I want to talk about a German duke named Otto of Wittenberg. And what happens is the church comes to him and asks him for some land, to give up some land. And he wouldn't agree to give up the land to the Pope Gregory VII. As a result, Gregory VII excommunicates Otto. And Otto at the time says, "Okay, whatever, you excommunicate me. I'm just going to go back to living my life as a royal. It doesn't. I'm living the good life. It doesn't necessarily matter." However, when Otto went home back to Wittenberg, no one would obey him because God no longer appointed him. Right. So the idea is that if you were a leader during the Middle Ages, you had to be appointed by God. This idea of the divine right of kings. And so if you were not appointed by God, if you're excommunicated, we don't need to follow you because you're not a man of God. And so what happened is that he had to go back to Gregory VII to plead for forgiveness. And at the time, Gregory VII was at his vacation, the Pope's vacation home in the Alps and in the northern part of Italy. And the Alps are high altitude. It's pretty snowy up there. And so Otto stood out the Pope's gates to his castle for 3 days, barefoot, on his knees, begging for Gregory to eventually forgive him and to let him back in the church. And eventually Gregory did, and all was well. Otto went back to ruling. But it shows the dominance, how pervasive, medieval life or Christianity was during medieval life. I wanted to turn our attention now to kind of the end of the story of the Renaissance, just to talk about the legacy of the Renaissance, to show you how vital it was. A lot of modern life would be vastly different if there was no Renaissance. And so one of the lasting legacies of the Renaissance was the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus. And this comes from First Nephi, right? So we're all familiar with this coming from the Book of Mormon. And it talks about Christopher Columbus and this, journey to the New World. And it says, I looked and beheld a man among the Gentiles who was separated from the seed of my brethren and many waters. And I beheld the Spirit of God, and it came down and wrought upon the man. And he went forth upon the many waters, even unto the seed of my brethren who were in the promised land. And so this talks about, the prophecy of Columbus coming to the New World and discovering this new land of promise. And it's kind of interesting that on a hunch, Columbus decided to sail to the west because he wanted to reach India, right? But because of his miscalculations, he believed that the world was much smaller than it was. I mean, at the time, I know the typical story was, at the time, people thought that the world was flat. Well, for the most part, most of the scientists at the time, they knew that it was round, and so it necessarily wasn't a big, thing that he was sailing out and beyond. But what was interesting is that he actually kind of, it was a bit of a blunder on his part. But no one expected what he would find. He didn't find India, but what he found was a new world of people that were unknown to the Europeans. And so it was kind of interesting that it changed the way that they saw the world, that the world was much larger than they initially thought it possible. We're familiar with the quote from the Book of Mormon, but what we generally don't read is actually Christopher Columbus's experience with this. And so it's interesting if you take a look at, from First Nephi, where it talks about how the Spirit of God came down and wrought upon him, and then he felt impressed to move upon the waters. But this is how he describes it. He says, with a hand that could be felt, the Lord opened my mind to the fact that it would be possible to sail from here to the Indies. And he opened my will to desire to accomplish the project, right? So that's very similar to what we see in, First Nephi, almost identical, right? And this is just from Columbus's writings, right? From his experiences. He says, this was the fire that burned within me when I came to visit your highness, right? So this idea of this fire burning within him, motivating him. Who can doubt this fire was not merely mine, but also the Holy Spirit, which encouraged me with a radiance of marvelous illumination from his sacred scriptures. And so this is his description of his spiritual journey, and him being prompted and motivated and inspired to be able to go out and to see the New World. And so a lot of this class we're going to take a look at is not only telling you the story of the major cultural developments, but it's also telling the story of the Restoration. This certainly was a big part of it, is finding the New World, where this new land of freedom that is going to help bring it about. This is, again, from his journals, and it's kind of interesting to me to read his journals and what he felt, what he saw in his experiences. And this comes from Sunday, October 21st. I think it's 1492. He says, at 10 o'clock, we arrived at a camp of the island. The island here is Cuba, and anchored the other vessels in company. After having dispatched a meal, I went ashore and found no habitation save a single house, and that without an occupant. We had no doubt that the people had fled in terror of our approach. And so you have to think about this huge boat coming up, and these people are like, what in the world is that? So they left. As the house was completely furnished, I suffered nothing to be touched, and went with my captains and some of the crew to view the country. The island even exceeds the others in beauty and fertility. Groves of lofty and flourishing trees are abundant, and also large lakes surrounded and overhung by the foliage in a most enchanting manner. Everything looked as green as in April in Andalusia, which is in Spain. The melody of the birds was so exquisite that one was never willing to part from the spot, and the flocks of parrots obscured the heavens. The diversity in the appearance of the feathered tribe from those of our country is extremely curious. 1,000 different sort of trees with their fruit were to be met with, and of a wonderfully delicious odor. And so what he's describing here is, in some senses, is Eden, right? He's describing this beautiful, idyllic place that's kind of away from human civilization. And for the next, several centuries, this is going to be how people see the new world, is this new Eden, this new place to go that's been untouched by human corruptions, and they're going to go there to seek their new life and to seek this kind of new inspiration. So the Puritans, when they come here, they see that also as this kind of Eden place. Another discovery within the New World, he brings up a lot of plants such as tobacco and other plants back with him. Another discovery or something that he brings back with him, unfortunately, are slaves. He brings a lot of the Native Americans with him back to Europe as slaves. But one particular thing started to change the world. He brought one particular plant that created a massive stir, that people in Europe were completely enamored with it, to the point that women would even swoon because of it, right? So much to the point that the Pope had to outlaw it. He had to create an edict that said it was sinful to consume. And so then the question is, what is that they brought back with them? It was chocolate. Right, and this is Cortez, right? He says, from time to time they served him Montezuma, or the chocolate, in cups of pure gold, a certain drink made from cacao. It was said that it gave one power over women, but this I never saw. I did see them bring in more than 50 large pitchers of cacao with froth in it, and he drank some of it, the women serving with great reverence. And so kind of an interesting how this cocoa bean comes over to Europe. And at the time, mainly it was put in a drink. It wasn't really until the 19th century that the Swiss decide to add milk to it and make it sweeter, because actual cocoa is pretty bitter. If you've ever tried baking chocolate, it's really hard to consume. And so mainly it was drunk at the time, or was put in a drink at a time. But later Switzerland started to add milk to it, and they made it the world phenomenon. And here you see, this is Brock, Switzerland. This is a place that I traveled a few years ago, which is home of chocolate. Here you see Cailler Chocolate at the right. This is the factory of Cailler Chocolate, and then next to them is the factory of Nestle. And so my wife and I toured the chocolate factory, and at the very end, and it gives the history of chocolate, where it comes from in the Americas, and how the people it was creating a frenzy to the point that the Pope had to create that edict. But then how it evolves over time. And so part of the Renaissance is this legacy of chocolate as well. And at the very end of this tour that we went on, there was a large table about 15 feet long that had every piece of chocolate that Cailler Chocolate made, and they said free samples. And so we were able to sample as much as we want. It was really fun. Another element of the legacy of the Renaissance was the printing press. And what the printing press does is it makes the printed word more accessible, right? Rather than having to, a book, if you have to handwrite every single copy, it's a very painstaking and laborious process. And so books were extremely expensive, to the point that people didn't generally have them. And so there was really no point to read. That's why a lot of the Middle Ages, the people during the Middle Ages, were illiterate, is there was just really no point, because you couldn't really get your hands on them. So the only ones that really had hands on the text were either the really wealthy or people associated with the church. And so what Gutenberg does with the printing press is he makes this idea of removable typeface. And so the idea is that you can print more than one copy, and just over and over and over, which makes it takes the cost of the book down, and so it makes books more accessible. So rather than like paying a year's wages for a book, now you can just pay like a month or two's wages, and you can own a book. And so the one book that everyone started to purchase during the Renaissance was the Bible. Everyone had a Bible that they would pass on from generation to generation, and so this made ideas more accessible to people. And so what the internet was for the 20th and 21st century, the printing press was for the Renaissance, making people be able to think, allowing people to be able to think, to read, and interpret for themselves rather than having to rely on others to do this. And this is just a book here that I was able to see when I was in Florence. They had a display. And the book here, the size, you can't really tell what the size is, but this book is about, I would say, about 2.5 feet long. It's just ginormous. And then you can kind of see how elaborately they were decorated. They believed that every page was so important that they, because it was so hard to get access to text, that they wanted to decorate it. So they really took care of their printed word. They found it valuable to a point where maybe we take it a little bit more for granted today. President Joseph Fielding Smith said about the printing press, he says, the publication of books, including the Bible, was too great a force to be stemmed. Like an irresistible flood, printing and the desire to read was what was printed, swept over the entire land. And so this idea of this thirst for knowledge, which is going to be a big part of the Renaissance, it's going to be one of the founding legacies of what comes out of it. Another major part of the Renaissance is the Reformation with Martin Luther, this idea of moving away from the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church. It started. The Roman Catholic Church's power started to deteriorate, and it starts with Martin Luther and questioning whether the Pope is actually legitimately put into power. And what this does, it again paves the way for the Reformation. This idea of moving away from the dominance of Roman Catholic thought. Elder McConkie said, Luther's break from Catholicism was part of the divine program. It came as an Elias preparing the way for the Restoration. And another element of the Renaissance, the legacy of the Renaissance, is the advent of the telescope from Galileo Galilei. And what we see with him is what he shows is that the universe is much larger than what we intended it to be, or what we thought it to be. And so much like Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, making the world seem much larger than initially intended, and there's much more out there to be discovered. Galileo's telescope here does something very similar to the universe around us. It shows that the universe seems limitless. And so, because of this, did our possibilities or ability to understand it. We begin to see the world, right, due to the Renaissance, as it really is, rather than as people within the Catholic Church said it to be, right, or rather than how they wanted it to be. And so this becomes one of the major foundational principles that come from as a legacy of the Renaissance. Another element of the legacy of the Renaissance are the artists that come out of this. Botticelli, Fra Angelico, Donatello, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, Bramante, Brunelleschi, Ghiberti, Alberti, Albrecht Dürer, Jan van Eyck, Giorgio Vasari, Matthias Grunwald, Hieronymus Bosch, Giovanni Bellini, and the list goes on. And this perhaps no other era has as many major artists or their works produced. It was an era of excitement, of understanding what are the possibilities of humanity. As we start to see the world start to increase, we start to see the universe start to increase, people's imaginations become on fire, and people are really excited about what does this mean and how do we make sense of this ever-expanding world and this ever-expanding universe. What does this mean for the human condition? And we're going to see that. And we also see the last thing I want to take a look at is the view of humanity. The main development during the Renaissance was that all of these studies or all these insights and discoveries changed the way that we see humanity. We no longer viewed ourselves as an evil accident of creation, where humans were inherently corrupt due to the fruit, the tree of knowledge. We stopped seeing ourselves as agents to be acted upon by the Catholic Church or by divine providence. And we started to see ourselves as agents to act. And we'll talk about some of those major intellectual changes in the upcoming lectures. We took our destiny, and that's really one of the main foundational principles of the Renaissance. We take our destiny into our own hands. We took control of our lives. And from this, we developed the study of humanities. We saw ourselves as worthy enough to study that we didn't necessarily have to be on our knees praying every day to God, but we can study ourselves because we are a part of the creation of God. So we want to understand how we fit into that. And so that's really where the humanities come from, right? This idea of who am I, why am I here, where am I going, and what is the meaning to life? We look for answers beyond just Roman Catholicism. What we were looking for, and this is kind of the main legacy of the Renaissance, we were looking for truth. None of these other developments would ever happen if we weren't, studying beyond this idea of the Roman Catholic thoughts, right? The kind of the narrow scope that the Middle Ages provided for them, right? None of this would happen if people weren't really searching for truth, right? And that's really what pushes the Renaissance. And we're going to see how these ideas start to shape the art and the literature that comes out of this era.